To the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 1. As you're turning over there, I want to just tell you a quick thank you. Last week, Mark Ennis covered for me and did a fantastic job if you were here for that. I think he and PJ are off on a boat somewhere right now, but he did a great job. Our family was in Kentucky for my middle brother's wedding, which was fantastic. But let me tell you this, I get the opportunity to travel some, and certainly during the summer, you'll see I'll be in and out like I was last summer, speaking at other places, especially on Wednesday nights. And when we travel, we get to go to other churches, and there's a lot of great churches out there, and me and Kyla got to go to the church that I kind of grew up at this past Sunday and worship, and that was great for a lot of reasons. But let me tell you this, there's nothing like coming home, and there's a lot of great churches out there, but Gold Hill is one of one. It is a blessing to be a part of this church family. It's because of you. You make this church family incredible. I don't tell you this enough, but I love you, and I'm very thankful for you. And every time I go away, I'm always that much more ready to come back and come home, and it's always good to be back. We're going to start a series for the next few weeks, simply entitled Ruth. We a lot of times do what are known as topical sermon series because we want to hone in on a particular idea or topic or theme within Scripture. And I think it's a very effective way to teach and to learn because we get very pointed about what we're trying to pull out of God's Word, and we use a variety of Old Testament, New Testament, different things to help us achieve that goal. But every so often, I want us to take a step back and look at books of the Bible in their totality. And that's not to say that we're going to get to dive into every single verse, although we are going to read every verse of the book of Ruth. It's about 87, 88 verses long. It's only 4 chapters. But it's an incredible book of the Old Testament, and this is going to carry over as well into Sunday nights. Sunday nights, we're going back to preaching, and we are going to be diving into books of the Bible, and there we will be going into much more depth each week. But this sermon series is going to be a little bit of a unique in the sense that we are just going to go through the text, expositionally go through the text, and see what it is that makes Ruth such an incredible book of the Bible. I think there's a couple of unique things about Ruth that always draw me back to Ruth. It's one of my all-time favorite books of the Bible. Ruth and Esther, I like reading together, not necessarily because they're at the same time period, but because it requires an additional faith on their part. And I think it's also unique that they're some of the few women that get prominently mentioned throughout Scripture. But Esther and Ruth both have the theme of God working providentially in the background. Right? We read through the book of Ruth, we read through the book of Esther, and we see, and certainly from the finish, when we look from the end back, we clearly see God's hand guiding Ruth, guiding Esther, but not as often in the foreground. Ruth and Esther are not your big miracle books. The Red Sea's not getting parted. People aren't being healed by the thousands. There's not big sermons being preached. But it's a family that made decisions. They were living with the consequences of those decisions, and then essentially trying to decide when to come home. And God helps guide that. And I think in a lot of ways, our life reflects the book of Ruth. Because we'll look at this morning in Ruth chapter 1, we see Ruth and Naomi get paired together kind of in an unlikely way through marriage, but then the husbands and sons pass away. And then there's the choice of what to do, right? That Elimelech, who was the patriarch of this family, had sent them to Moab, which was against what God's will was. We know Moab and the Moabites were constantly a thorn in Israel's side. It was a nation that God despised. We see that all throughout the Old Testament, especially in the book of Psalms. So he said, don't intermarry, don't go to Moab, but Elimelech brought his family there, which was a poor choice. And then it was kind of, you've heard me say this before, what's the next best choice? And that's kind of where Naomi and Ruth find themselves. They come back, and it's just an incredible story that I want the text to guide our understanding of what this is. And so we're going to read Ruth chapter 1 in its entirety. Again, it goes fairly quickly. We'll do this every week. So the four installments, the 4 weeks of this series are the 4 chapters of the book of Ruth. And by the end of this, you will have read or listened at least to the book of Ruth. And I want you to pay particular attention to the first 5 verses. That's where we're going to do the majority of kind of our really text analysis this morning. But I want you to listen to Ruth 1. In the days when the judges ruled, now pay attention to that, we're going to come back to that. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons, the name of the man was Elimelech, and his name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. That'll come back in a minute. The name was Orpah. The name of the other was Ruth. And they lived about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place in which she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's home. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them and lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we won't return with you. No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait until they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me." Remember that. We'll come back to it. "For your sake, that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." Verse 16 may be the most known verse in the book of Ruth, for good reason. But Ruth said, "Don't urge me to leave you or return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they had come to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Ruth chapter 1 gives us so much as it kind of sets the outline for our study together. I want to look at just a few verses to kind of set the stage for what's going on here. We see Elimelech, who is a man who moved his family to Moab. Naomi is the wife of Elimelech. Naomi and Ruth are going to be the main players of this, but we got to see how they came together. So Elimelech was the patriarch. Naomi was his wife. They had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, who already are basically out of the picture. They travel with their family to Moab, but die. We don't know from what. And then there's 2 Moabite women that the sons marry, which is another problem that God has, because he tells Israel over and over and over, and Moab is maybe on the top of this list, don't marry foreign women. And it's not that God doesn't care about everybody, but he says, here's the problem that's going to come with intermarrying is they're going to bring their gods, and they're going to bring their preference and their traditions, and we see that over and over and over again. So we have these 2 daughters-in-law that are now left with Naomi. So we look at this, and just briefly, if you want to look on this map, Judah's on your left, Moab is on your right, and you have the Salt Sea, or what's more commonly called the Dead Sea. And you see this journey that was from Bethlehem to Moab. Now, just for your reference, because that's going to come back in a minute, That's about 50 miles as the crow flies for us. 50 miles from Bethlehem down to Moab. So again, if you're walking even at a moderate pace, you could get there in about a day or two, right? So this is not thousands of miles separated, but we see culturally they're very different. And I want you to remember the 50-mile thing because it's going to come back. Because remember, they lived in Moab for 10 years. 10 years despite things not going well. Again, admittedly, we don't know the timeline. We don't know exactly when Elimelech dies. We don't know when the sons die, but presumably sometime along there. And you would think that Naomi would, being the woman that she was, having the raising that she did in Bethlehem, that she would want to return back to her people. But they stay 10 years. And it's not a weeks-long trip. We're talking a day. And that's going to be the kind of the crux of our lesson is looking at the difference between Moab and Bethlehem. And we're going to see kind of the way that Naomi deals with this. So go back and let's reread 1 and 2 because I want you to pay particular attention to a few things in the first 2 verses here. In the days when the judges ruled. Now pay attention to this. And in fact, if you have your Bible and are in Ruth, turn back 1 page. The book right before Ruth is, you guessed it, is Judges. And I want you to look at what happens right at the very end. In fact, the last verse in Judges 21 says, or in Judges 21 verse 25, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's going to set us up for Ruth chapter 1. So remember, there's a period of the judges where there wasn't kings, that God raised up a series of people that we call the judges that were put in place for a particular time, and then they went away. It wasn't a king. It was somebody to judge and to guide Israel. But we know at the end of this judge period, and if you look through the judges, there was kind of an up and down of we had some really great judges, we had some okay judges, but at the end of this, it says that the people were doing what they thought was right. Not what God thought was right, not what he would have them to do, but what they thought was best. And that's going to we're going to see that in the life of Elimelech. Because Elimelech and his wife Naomi are there in kind of a tough time in Israel's history. We can even see this historically and archaeologically. They know that famine was going around, especially in northern Israel at this time. So they were struggling. Admittedly, they were struggling. But instead of looking to God and staying faithful and realizing that God can and will deliver his people, they said, well, there may be better opportunities over in Moab. In spite of the fact that God had given them explicit instructions not to go, Elimelech takes a little bit more assurance, worldly, earthly, monetary assurance to go to Moab to provide for his family, but he loses the spiritual side in the process. And I want to look at this in the book of Ruth this morning. So we see this, the judges were ruling, so this kind of gives us a framework for where they were. It was a famine in the land, so a man from Bethlehem in Judah went with his wife and his 2 sons to the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi. Their sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. I want us to think about this as we look through this. What do we do when times get tough? I want you to think about this not just from a spiritual perspective, but from every facet of your life. What do you do when things get difficult? Because I'm going to suggest to you that our response to that will illuminate and show a lot of our lives. How we handle adversity gives us a pretty clear understanding of how we're going to act, how we're not going to act, what we're going to say, what we're not going to say when things are good. What do we do when times get tough? Because that's where we find Elimelech in his story. Again, we empathize because he's providing for his family, right? Things are hard, food's hard to come by. And so many of us would say, well, he's doing what many of us would do. Right? We struggle. Where we are is not the best spot for us. And so we uproot our family and we move them somewhere else. But do we do that at the cost of our family's spiritual health? I've seen this over and over and over again of a little bit better opportunity, families that are thriving spiritually, they uproot themselves to go for a better job. And there are great reasons to move for better jobs. There are times where it is an absolute necessity, so don't misunderstand. But assuming everything is okay, we uproot our family for a marginally better opportunity, and then we move somewhere to where our spiritual health is not considered at all. And families backslide and completely lose faith entirely. I mean, that's worst case scenario, but then you have everything in between. And that's essentially what happened for Elimelech. He moves his family out of Bethlehem where God was, and he moved them to where God was not. What do we do when times get tough? Let's read verses 3 through 5. Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. So they married foreigners that were going to bring foreign gods, and Moabite gods were about as bad as they got. They sacrificed children. They certainly had no respect for the God of Israel. Again, we don't know exactly what these 2 families are like specifically. I kind of have to think that Ruth, something is special about Ruth, to the degree that she's willing to listen, and we're going to hear her say in verse 16, your God is going to become my God, and that's capital G in both. So she's saying, your God, the God of Israel, is going to become my God. Now, that may be partly because of Naomi's example, and there's probably a lesson unto itself of the example we set for other people. But Ruth was obviously a special person that was willing and able to listen. But nonetheless, they were still Moabites. There were 2 of them, and they had lived about 10 years, and both the sons passed away. We jump to verse 16. When Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. I want you to think about this with me. To get to the right place, we have to leave the wrong one. This series is going to be a little bit broken in terms of normally I give you some very defined note-taking points. We're going to kind of pull back on that a little and let the text kind of speak for itself, but I do want you to think about a couple things. This is one of them. To get to the right place, to get back to Bethlehem, to get back, because again, you could very easily, again, there's a little bit of a metaphor here, but we're kind of assuming Moab is away from God, Bethlehem is coming back home to God. And when we think about it that way, this is not dissimilar from our life now. We leave and we go away from time to time for a variety of reasons. But then to get back home, there are times where we feel like we are the prodigal, right? We are the prodigal son that needs to come back home. And to do that, we have to leave the wrong place. And there's so many times where we try to leave one foot in the other camp. Right, we want to come back and receive the blessings of God, but for whatever reason, we don't want to entirely leave what's wrong. We don't want to entirely leave sinful living. We don't want to leave Moab. Right, we've been there for 10 years. For whatever reason, that's got a hold on us, and we want to stay there, but also receive God's blessing. Friends, it doesn't work that way. To get to the right place, you have to leave the wrong one. To get back to Bethlehem, you have to travel the 50 miles from Moab into Israel. You have to go around the Dead Sea. You can't be in both. Let Moab and Bethlehem, let those be a metaphorical understanding of God's righteousness and sinfulness that the world offers. You can't be in both. You're either going to be home or you're going to be away. To get to the right place, you have to leave the wrong one. God guided Naomi and Ruth, as we see in our reading here. He provided for them in, I think, 2 ways. He provided for them in place because he's sending them back to Bethlehem. And these are kind of big themes that we're going to look at throughout the book here that are going to get more defined as we get into chapters 2, 3, and 4. But we're going to see Bethlehem is home. It's their home, but it's also where God is. And that's going to be a constant theme throughout the book of Ruth. It's where they had relatives. It's where they had people that supported them. That's going to be a big theme throughout the book of Ruth. Where they could get back in fellowship with God's people, perhaps most importantly. And it's where provision was. It's where they would be taken care of, not just physically, but spiritually as well. We're going to look here in future chapters. I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but Many of you are familiar with the story of Ruth, and we're going to see an amazing man by the name of Boaz that's going to come in and not only provide for Ruth and Naomi in a physical sense, but in a spiritual sense and an emotional sense. Boaz is one of the most incredible men in the Bible, certainly in the Old Testament. Comes in and provides for a family that has nothing. So God provided in the sense of place, but he also provided in the sense of time. There's a timing to this. They came back at the beginning of the barley harvest, which is going to come into play in chapters 2, 3, and 4. It was a time of provision, and it was a time of opportunity. I want us to think about the way God oftentimes moves in our lives, and we see very similar the way he functions for us. There's a timing to it. There's a place to it. There's a design behind it. We look at the story of Ruth, and I don't want to get too far into this, but we see, I'll give you a little bit of preview of the rest of this. From the lineage of Ruth and a man by the name of Boaz, we're ultimately going to get Christ. So what I want you to take away from today is decisions that we make matter. What do you do when times get tough? Don't think that those decisions don't have any ramifications, good and bad. Don't think they don't have consequences, good and bad, because recognize that when times got really tough, Naomi and Ruth could have chosen to stay in Moab. That's where Ruth's family was. That would have made more sense. That's where they already were. That's where they had spent the last 10 years of their life. But when times got tough, they recognized that the God of Israel was worth risking for. It was worth traveling back to Bethlehem for. It was worth to get back in relation and fellowship with God's people. Decisions that we make matter. The choice that Ruth made to stay with Naomi would quite literally have eternal consequences in the most beautiful sense. That Ruth is going to meet a man by the name of Boaz. Boaz is going to marry a Moabite woman and redeem her out of her situation. And that union is going to ultimately give us the lineage of Christ. Friends, decisions matter. Decisions in times of trial may matter all the more. I read it this way. All the good that happens in the future chapters begins here. They're referencing Ruth chapter 1. When Naomi is godly repentance and honesty, it will make a difference not only in her life, but in the life of her daughter-in-law, Ruth, and in the destiny of the nation of Israel, and in eternal salvation. It is possible for God to accomplish amazing things both for now and eternity if we will turn towards him today, not just in feeling, but in action. You know, it's interesting, and we certainly didn't plan it this way, but this morning in class, Steve's doing a great job, talked about the prayer and the way that, you know, we have our prayers, but then we oftentimes aren't prepared, maybe the right word, for the opportunity that follows. I'm going to suggest to you that Ruth has the same opportunity of, it would have been very easy to have the feelings, the desires of, I want to go back home. I want to get back in communion with God. Naomi was probably teaching this, and it would have been easy to think those things, but taking action is another step. Action is one of the great themes of the book of Ruth, as we see this willingness to go out on a limb. As we end this morning and the lesson's yours, the decisions we make today can have eternal consequences. And I mean that in the most beautiful sense, in the best way. The decisions you make today can matter tomorrow. The decisions Ruth made in the decision to stay with Naomi, not only to stay with Naomi, but to go back to Naomi's home, not only to go back to Naomi's home, but to adopt not only her people, but her God, not only to adopt her God, but to worship earnestly, to go out and work in the barley harvest, to take the opportunities that God places before her. She's going to meet a guy by the name of Boaz, and they're going to meet, and they're going to go through this relationship cycle, and Ruth is willing to go through this. Decision after decision after decision would lead us to Christ. So don't ever think that in trials, in times of trials, or in times of joy, that decisions you make today don't matter. Don't think that the decisions you make today don't have consequences, good and bad, because the decisions you make today very well may have eternal consequences. You may interact with somebody today that interaction means very little to you, but may make an eternal impact on somebody else. It's the entire premise of the parable of the sower. We have an opportunity, we go out in our everyday lives, and we talk and we interact with people and we spread seed, most of which, 99% of which, we don't see the fruit of, but it could make a difference. We see decisions made an eternal impact on Ruth. She's going to come back to Bethlehem, and we'll start in chapter 2 next week, seeing the beginnings of this incredible relationship. Choices you make today could change your eternity, could change the eternity of somebody else. If you're not a Christian, we want to give you that opportunity to put on Christ in baptism, to make the most incredible choice that you could ever make that, for fact, has eternal implications that will allow you to be united with Christ one day. If that's your need this morning, we want to give you that opportunity. Maybe you just need prayers. You know, again, Naomi, her name means pleasant. But when she comes back to Bethlehem, she says, call me Mara, which literally in the Hebrew means bitter. Because she felt like God had slighted her, even though God's working for her benefit. And she'll see that later on. But maybe you're struggling. Maybe you've been in your Moab for some time and want to come back home and you're just struggling. Maybe you just need support or guidance there. We'd love to help you with that as well. If we can do anything for you, would you come let us know about it as we stand and as we sing together?